Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming in for the 12th International Freedom Scholar presentations. Wow, sounds like a full dozen. This is a lovely idea there. Well, this program got started, like I said, 12 years ago. It all started when I attended a global studies program at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. The program was getting started. Every state was starting off with a global studies program. I attended it, and of course, I immediately didn't like a whole lot of it, but I came back and I talked to Judy Verlin, who used to be the head of the history department in those days, and saying, Judy, we can do this. We have everything here and we can tweak it and we can put a research paper, a thesis, a presentation, put in more stuff. And those of you who knew Judy Verlin, Mrs. Verlin, she was short and really smart. She immediately jumped up, pulled her head and said, let's do it. So both of us went running to poor Dr. Davis's office and saying, damn, we have something to discuss. He takes one look and he's like, okay, ladies, let's hear about it. So that's how it got started. Initially, it was a way smaller program. Our kids presented, the scholars presented in the assembly. Then year 6 is when we started presenting it completely to the board of directors. So what is this entire program about? The key components of the International Freedom Scholars Program, every student needs to have 4 years of one world language. That's the core requirement. Like Lexi out here, she had AP Latin. Same thing, Shri out here, AP Latin.
No, Latin 4.
Latin 4. Still you're going into the 4th year, and that's the way you're going into AP Spanish or AP German, etc. Junior year, AP Microeconomics. That's again, or we're ready to go with microeconomics, but that's a core requirement. Besides that, students need 2 electives. Again, because Lexi is sitting in front of me, she has AP Macroeconomics, AP Comparative Government and Politics. It is something different out there. Each of these classes need to have an international component to it. So whether it's coming as a government politics thing, an economics thing, every single department has given us classes. Right? So it could be an additional language, 3rd year of an additional language. If it is the math department, it's AP Statistics. They can take AP Statistics, do a little additional project out there with international data. It can be, for the matter, it can be AP Research with an international component. Right? Science has given us ecology. As far as English is concerned, world literature. Anyone can take that. A number of different history classes. There is even, if you go into the arts, there's AP Art with a little international portfolio. We have had students do that. 4th year, honors choir. Student takes it up like Harrison out here. He has taken instrumental music for his 4th year right now. And he has then composed a piece of music with one of the countries that he has chosen. And that's the way it's always gone about. So next week, those of you attending the upper school spring concert, you will hear Harrison's music being played by the band there. And that's the way it's been. It's been across the board. Students do that. If they meet the core requirements, then senior year, they meet with Mrs. Pryor and myself. So once Mrs. Verlin retired, Mrs. Pryor became my partner in crime out there. So we are the ones together. And now Dr. Davis got sucked into it. He decided to retire and we said, oh, no, let's come along here. So that's a big part of it. They sign up for the International Freedom Seminar. If they meet the requirements, we meet once a week. It's a 0-hour class. We meet on Thursdays. And it's a discussion based on Brookfield Academy's freedom philosophy principles. 10 principles, 20 weeks, in other words. So 1 week, I give them an article pertaining to one of those freedom philosophy principles. The next week, they bring an article pertaining to that particular freedom philosophy, again, from one of their countries. I tend to say one country. If it's people like Lexi or Mahi or any of the others out here, they tend to get for all 3 countries, 3 different articles. So it becomes a learning process, a discussion process, a growth process for them as well as for us. I think I learn more every single year with every single student based on what they're doing. So at the end of the junior year, when I meet with them for the first time and I ask them, what topic are you interested in? It can be anything and everything. We have had all sorts of topics, really. Sky's the limit, whatever interests them. Of course, it has to be legitimate stuff. I've never entertained, can I murder someone? The freedom to kill, that doesn't come in. Everything very legitimate. Freedom of education, freedom to vote, freedom to trade, right? Freedom to pursue education, for healthcare. There are so many different topics. Like, for example, today we're going to hear from Mahi, freedom to access organ transplantation. From Harrison, freedom for parents to make educational decisions. From Shri, it's going to be freedom to access sound therapy. From Lexi, it's going to be freedom to access medication for anxiety and mental depression. And then they choose any 3 countries from around the world. I tend to say 1 per continent kind of a thing, but that's to see how is freedom being represented in different parts of the world. I mean, the mission of Brookfield Academy completely is to graduate students prepared for college and life, educated, skills, values, and heritage of responsible, constructive, free people. And that's exactly what we're encouraging in the students in this program, to figure out the concept of freedom all across the globe in different parts of the world. So without further ado, I am going to hand it over to Mahi, who is going to be our first speaker. And she's going to be talking about freedom to access organ transplantation with special focus on Spain, India, and Ethiopia.
Good evening. My name is Mahi Hirpara. I am a senior at Brookfield Academy. I've been attending Brookfield Academy since my freshman year of high school. And in the future, I hope to attend medical school and become a transplant surgeon. My interest in transplantation began all the way back in 2007 when a relative of mine received a lung transplant. Ever since then, I've been increasingly interested in transplantation and the ethics behind it. Starting off, the thesis of this study: the access to organ transplantations is not only dependent on having available organs, but also on the individual's freedom, government policies, and healthcare infrastructure. These systems can either expand or restrict access, making organ transplants a privilege for some rather than a right for all. The results of this study have been analyzed through 3 Brookfield Academy freedom philosophy principles. First, personal responsibility. Second, freedom of the individual. And third, looking to the future, making a difference. We will return back to this topic at the end of the presentation. Before we delve into the study, let's begin with some key definitions. What is an organ? An organ is a collection of tissues joined in a structural unit to serve one common function. Some common organs include your heart, your lungs, your kidneys, and your liver. Now you may ask, why would an organ fail? An organ may fail due to a variety of reasons, the most common including chronic disease and traumatic injury. So, what is organ transplantation? Organ transplantation is a medical procedure in which a damaged organ is removed and replaced by a healthy one from a donor. Organ transplantation is performed by a transplant surgeon who has undergone many years of medical schooling and training in order to perform this procedure. Organs can come from 2 types of donors: living and deceased. There are 3 countries under examination here today. First, Ethiopia, second, Spain, and third, India. The United States of America has been used as a basis of comparison for this study. These 3 countries were chosen because of their wide diversity, both in global placement, as you can see, they are on different continents, and secondly, because they are very different in their healthcare structures and infrastructure as well. Before you have to understand the healthcare, you have to understand each country's individual history and culture. Beginning with the United States of America. As we all know, the United States of America is built on Judeo-Christian values, and we are influenced by immigrants from all over the world. Spain. The most important thing to note here is that Spain has strong ties to Catholicism, and every day it's becoming more and more secular. Spain also highly values work-life balance. For example, after lunch every day in Spain, there is a break where workers tend to go home and spend time with their family. As you can see, very high value of work-life balance. India. India was under the British colonial rule from the 18th to mid-20th century. This led to a lot of suffering. India has a lot of diverse cultures with deep roots in Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism, and many other religions, including Christianity. India has a strong focus on family, community, and spirituality. Lastly, Ethiopia. Ethiopia has a strong connection to Orthodox Christianity, and those spiritual practices are at the core of everyday life. And now they have a focus on economic development and social progress, specifically in the areas of education and healthcare. Now that we've learned some more about the history and culture of each of the countries, we can now more further analyze the organ transplantation and healthcare systems in each of the countries. Starting with the United States of America. For our organ transplant system, we have the National Organ Transplant Act of 1984. Essentially, it's a nationwide organ donation and matching system. In terms of statistics, over 100,000 people are on the organ transplant list as of today. 17 deaths occur daily due to the lack of organ availability. And the most important thing to note here is that the United States of America has an opt-in system, meaning that the citizens of the United States of America must give explicit consent to be an organ donor. Spain has the highest donation rates in the world, with approximately 46.9 donors per million people in 2022. The most important thing to note here, Spain has an opt-out system. There is a presumed consent. All the citizens of Spain are presumed to be organ donors unless if they go and fill out the paperwork saying that they do not want to donate their organs. This leads to very, very high organ donation rates. India. In India, the first kidney transplant occurred in the 1970s. Similar to the United States of America, they have the Transplantation of Human Organs Act of 1994. It is passed to regulate organ transplantation and prevent trafficking. And once again, similar to the United States, they have an opt-in system, and individuals or families must give explicit consent to donate their organs. One thing to note here, India has very low donation rates, with only 0.8 donors per million people in 2022. Lastly, Ethiopia. The first successful kidney transplant in Ethiopia took place in 2015. That is only 10 years ago. There is no national transplant policy, there is limited medical infrastructure, and a lack of regulations. In fact, many Ethiopians may travel outside of their country in order to receive a transplant that they are needing. Now let's move on to the actual study. There was a series of guided questions that were kept in mind in the conduction of this study. This was kept in mind to assure the consistency of the data throughout the study. But first, there is a quantitative research part of the study. To analyze access to organ transplantation across 4 countries, there was 2 targeted surveys conducted. First, to healthcare professionals like transplant surgeons and nephrologists, and secondly, to lay people, those people with no personal experience in organ transplantation. The data was then quantitatively analyzed to form an index which assessed the freedom to access organ transplantation. This index has been called the Organ Index. The null hypothesis in this study is that there is no significant relationship between a country's organ transplantation system and equitable access to those organ transplants. In other words, there is no significant difference in the data obtained from all these countries. The alternative hypothesis is that there is a significant relationship between a country's organ transplantation system and equitable access to organ transplants, with more developed systems leading to increased fairness and accessibility in organ transplantation. In other words, there is a significant difference in the data obtained. This is a list of the survey questions that were sent out to both healthcare professionals and lay people alike. The survey was conducted in 2 parts. One that asked about the healthcare system in general, and one that asked about organ transplantation systems specifically. The results are shown here. respondents were asked to rate from a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being the most and 1 being the least and 5 being the most, excuse me. Then an average was created in both the healthcare and organ transplantation parts. And lastly, the organ index was created by averaging the healthcare average and the organ average. Finally, a significance test was conducted, specifically a chi-squared test of homogeneity. The expected values were compared to those of the United States. And as you can see, we received a chi-squared value of 1.4795, and at an alpha level of 0.05, which is the most common alpha value that statisticians use. There is a 3.76% chance of receiving the data we received purely by chance. That means the data I received is statistically significant at alpha equals 0.05. That means that there is a statistically significant relationship between organ transplantation systems and the access to organs. The second part of this study included a qualitative data. Interviews were conducted with both medical professionals and lay people in each country, and each interviewee was asked the same set of questions, as noted here. This is a list of the people I interviewed from each country. As you can see, there's a wide variety of both careers and ages. There are 3 things that all interviewees agreed upon. 1, there's a need to educate people about organ donation. Many people are unaware of what their organ donation policies are, especially young people. Secondly, organ shortage. Even people in Spain who have the highest donation rates agreed that they are experiencing organ shortage. And lastly, barriers to accessing healthcare. Each interview agreed that there is a barrier to accessing healthcare in every country. In the United States, that may be the cost to going to a hospital, whereas in Ethiopia, it may be the lack of an actual hospital and a medical professional. Recommendations. I have 3 general recommendations for each of these countries. 1, to increase public awareness and education, specifically for young people. There are many misinformations out there about what organ donation is, and we need to make sure that especially our young generation knows what their organ donation policies are. Secondly, strengthen organ transplantation policies, meaning create a standardized policy that will ensure equitable allocation and transparency. Thirdly, improve healthcare accessibility and infrastructure. Just increasing the amount of healthcare professionals we have, the amount of hospitals we have, the amount of transplant centers we have will increase donation rates. For country-specific recommendations, for India, firstly, strengthen organ donation infrastructure and awareness. As I talked to the interviewees from India, I realized that a lot of them do not know what their organ donation policy is. So simply creating nationwide campaigns to make sure the citizens of India know what they are legally obligated to. Second, to improve transparency and regulation. India struggles a lot in the organ black market. So creating stricter rules, better policies to ensure that there is public trust in this organ transplantation system. Spain. Although Spain is leading in organ donation rates, the two recommendations I have, are 1, expand international collaboration for organ sharing. This could be especially critical for those rare matches, for rare blood types. Secondly, enhance public engagement to maintain high donation rates. In Spain, currently, there is an education system as part of their secondary education that educates high school students about their organ donation policies. However, making sure that that system is actually implemented, especially in rural areas, can truly help to increase donation rates. And lastly, in Ethiopia, first, invest in medical training and infrastructure. Increasing the sheer amount of doctors and hospitals we have in Ethiopia can help to increase donation rates. And secondly, to increase public awareness or address cultural concerns. Many Ethiopians, as I talked to them, I realized that they did not even know what organ donation is. What is an organ transplant? They had no idea. So increasing that public awareness of what it is can truly, truly help to bring those donation rates up. As I mentioned before, the results of this study have been analyzed through 3 Brookfield Academy freedom philosophy tenets: personal responsibility, freedom of the individual, and looking to the future, making a difference. Firstly, personal responsibility. The success of an organ transplant system depends on individual choices, not just policies. Personal responsibility includes choosing to register as a donor, advocating for better healthcare access, and if you hear someone spreading misinformation or myths about organ donation, challenging them. That is part of your personal responsibility. Secondly, freedom of the individual. True freedom in healthcare means both having the right to choose and the ability to act on that choice. A system that supports donation while respecting personal autonomy protects and enhances personal freedom. And lastly, looking to the future, making a difference. The future of organ transplantation depends on us, all of us in this room. We have to raise awareness, we have to reform policies, and we have to work on advancing medical technology. For example, artificial organs like the titanium heart could increase donation rates significantly in the future. Lastly, I'm going to leave you with the slogan of World Organ Donation Day. When you donate your organs, you give the gift of tomorrow. But what does that mean? It means you have the power to save lives. Not just 1, 8. 8 human beings, 8 chances at life. That could be 8 children. And that is what organ donation does. And the truth is, you don't have to be a doctor to save lives. All you have to do is have the heart to give the most powerful gift of all, the gift of tomorrow. Thank you.
All right, good evening, everyone. So my name is Harrison Koss. I'm also a senior at Brookfield Academy, and I've been coming here since freshman year. And my topic tonight is the freedom for parents to make educational decisions for their children. And this topic was particularly interesting to me, looking at what freedom parents have to determine where their children go to school, what type of education they receive, and what the quality of that education is. So my research question for this project was, are government educational policies the primary factor in determining whether or not parents have the freedom to make those educational decisions for their children? And then going off of that, the null hypothesis for this is that those policies are not the primary factor in allowing parents to make those decisions. So some key definitions moving forward. First of all, public education. When I'm talking about public education in this project, I'm talking about government funded, provided, and regulated system of secondary education. So I'm not talking about primary education, and I'm not talking about government provided college. Additionally, compulsory education is the legal requirement for children to attend school until a certain age or for a certain period of time. So moving on, I will also be viewing this presentation through the lens of these 3 freedom philosophies: free markets, freedom of the individual, and personal responsibility. But I'll get back to those in a little bit. So the 3 countries that I chose to study for this research project were Brazil, Sweden, and Bhutan. And the reason I chose these 3 countries is that they are not only very different culturally, but have drastically different policies on education. So starting off with Sweden, the main thing culturally to point out in regards to this research project is that their workforce is regarded as one of the most educated and skilled workforces in the world. And then with the policies themselves, it is a very heavily funded and heavily regulated system of education, both in the private and the public education systems, making both systems almost identical in the country. And this carries over into homeschooling too, which has actually been illegal in Sweden since 2011. So moving on to Bhutan, one of the main things to point out culturally is that they are a very familial and rural society. So nearly 56% of the population lives in rural areas. And this carries over into one of their most unique educational policies, which is that they have non-compulsory secondary education, which means that children after grade 10 are not required to go to school. And that's simply because it's not practical to require children who live in rural areas to go to school where there usually isn't even a building for them to attend. Additionally, parents are culturally expected, but also legally allowed to be fully involved in the educational process in Bhutan. So not only in choosing whether their kids go to school or not, where they go to school, but they're also expected to come in and have conversations with the teachers about what the curriculum should be and what to change with the school itself. Moving on to Brazil, culturally, there's a very prominent wealth gap in their society, making it close to 28% of the population living below the poverty line. And this carries over strongly into the educational system, where there is a wide range of qualities. Typically, public education in Brazil is very underfunded, and private education has much more resources. So there's a lot of variety there, and people that cannot afford private education in the country are typically left with very low quality education. All right, so the research methodology for me was primarily surveys that were sent to 3 countries. And so those surveys were primarily quantitative data, and I'll get to the questions in a second. But at the end, to supplement that, was a qualitative free response for participants to elaborate on what they had put down in their surveys. Additionally, for Bhutan, I interviewed a resident with children in the education system, Mahi Hirpara, to gain a little bit of insight into the culture there and also the education system and what it is like to be involved in that. And for Sweden, I sent questions to residents regarding their experiences and views of the education system. And for Brazil, I contacted the Ministry of Education to gain a little bit of insight into the policy decisions that they are making to address that wealth gap. So here are the survey questions. I asked participants to rate 5 things from 1 to 10. So first of all, the perceived quality of the current education system in their country, the perceived growth rate of that system, the overall level of education of their population, the level of involvement of parents in the education system, and also just the overall level of personal freedom in their country. So here are some of the survey results. So for the first few questions, you see that there is not a ton of variation, but the variation that we see is exactly what you would expect. So with education quality, we see Sweden in first. With system growth, we see Bhutan in first, and I'll get to why that is in a second. Education of the general population, Sweden is far above either of the other 2 countries. With parental involvement, Bhutan is significantly higher, and with personal freedom, Bhutan is significantly lower. So what did I use to analyze this data? So I used the Mann-Whitney U-test, and the reason I use this test is because it specializes in analyzing the distribution of abnormal data. And so what I mean by abnormal data is exactly what we see with the survey. So when I'm asking participants to rank something on an arbitrary scale of 1 to 10, the gap from 1 to 2 might be different than the gap from 9 to 10. And so what the Mann-Whitney U-test does is essentially reorganizes that scale and then compares the results to it to see if there's a statistical difference. And so after performing that test on all of the responses, we found 3 major statistical differences, which were the area of the amount of education that is perceived in the general population, where Sweden was significantly higher than the other 2, parental involvement, where Bhutan was significantly higher, and level of personal freedom, where Bhutan was significantly lower. So moving on to the qualitative data that I attained from both the questionnaire sent out and the free response at the end of the survey, the main thing that people from Sweden were responding to was the feeling that people are generally very well educated in their country. They are typically very satisfied with their system of education, even though there aren't a lot of options due to the heavy amount of regulation. For Bhutan, as I mentioned, I had that interview with resident Mahi Hirpara, and the key takeaway from that conversation was that Bhutan, a previously very closed nation, was kind of emerging from that mindset and now has this new desire to leap ahead on the world scale. And this is leading to a lot of educational reforms, like the English baccalaureate system, which was established and instituted in their public education very recently, and new standardized tests that were implemented throughout secondary schools. And from the free responses, we also see concerns about an outdated system. So this kind of implies that even though we're seeing all these policy changes from the government, it's a very slow-moving process, and a lot of people feel that the system is still not caught up to the rest of the world, even though the correct actions are being taken to build momentum in that direction. So moving on to Brazil, from the Ministry of Education, the main problem they are trying to address is that wealth gap that I was talking about earlier. And so there are currently a lot of programs in place to reduce this visible wealth gap, such as programs to incentivize children to stay in school longer, programs to address the shortage of teachers, training them and putting them in schools. And they are making that one of their top priorities. And we see why that is a priority from the survey responses, where people seem very dissatisfied with the public education in Brazil. And I had people say very often that if you have any money at all, you send your children to private education in Brazil because they're so dissatisfied with the government-provided system. So my conclusion from all of my research and surveys is that parents' freedom to make educational decisions for their children is primarily dependent on those government policies that give them the freedom to do so. And that's because we see this wide range of policies from Sweden, which has high regulation, high funding, where everything is basically uniform across private and public education, where parents typically do not have any decision of what type of education their children get, to Bhutan, where there's very little regulation and parents can decide whether or not to even send their children to school, to Brazil, where they are significantly underfunded, both in the schools themselves, but also the programs that are trying to fix it do not have enough funding. And so there's very little progress being made, and people who cannot afford private education are given very little option for quality education. So going off of that conclusion, I made some recommendations, and the main goals of these recommendations were first and foremost to make parents feel more empowered to be more heavily involved in the education system, both in choosing where and what the quality is of their children's education. Additionally, I'm trying to recommend to have more options within education and have high quality expectations in both private and public systems. So for Sweden in particular, my recommendations would be to decrease the regulations on private schools and to legalize homeschooling to get more variation within the education systems, to allow for more of a free market and to give parents more of an opportunity to send their children to a different type of school. For Bhutan, I would recommend to continue to allocate significant funding to public education. Some of you may have seen on this slide previously, but they're allocating roughly 8% of their GDP to education, which is very high, in an attempt to bring about these new educational reforms. And they have set themselves on this track to modernize the system, and if they continue to fund it properly, it will reach that point. Additionally, they should maintain that policy of non-compulsory secondary education simply because they don't have the infrastructure to support every child going to high school in the country. For Brazil, I would recommend to allocate more funding to the programs established to reduce that wealth gap. And that is because a lot of these programs are already in place, but they are either so new, some of them were established in late 2024, early 2025, or significantly underfunded to have any real effect at all. So as long as they allocate significant funding to those programs, the wealth gap in the education system will be addressed, and the quality of public education will meet the standards of what parents are expecting for their children. And so tying it back to the freedom philosophies, in order for parents to be able to make decisions for their children about where their children go to school, there needs to be some sort of free market for education. There needs to be some variety, which is quite the opposite of what we see with Sweden. There needs to be quality in both public and private education. There also needs to be some freedom of the individual, where parents are able to make that decision to send their kid to a specific school. And then once they have that freedom, they have to take it. It is their own responsibility to make the decision that is best for their child. And that responsibility should come out of the decisions of government policies and into the hands of the parents.
All right. Good evening. My name is Shrivatsaa Kannan. I've been at Brookfield Academy since I was a freshman, and I will be going to Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in the fall, majoring in biochem biophysics. So today I decided to make my presentation about the freedom to access sound therapy. Throughout my high school career, I've been involved with music for most of its life, and it was my clarinet teacher actually who told me about sound therapy in the first place and got me really interested in it. So, the three freedom principles I'll be focusing on today are freedom of the individual, personal responsibility, and looking to the future, making a difference. I'll talk more about how this ties back to my actual results near the end of my presentation. But before I start, what exactly is sound therapy? So sound therapy is essentially an umbrella term for anything music or vibration related that can influence your mind or your body health. It has a lot of roots, for example, mantras or singing bowls, or more traditionally here, singing choirs. And as of 2019, the World Health Organization has classified it as CAM, or complementary or alternative medicine. So in other words, not something completely traditional. And why exactly is it important to study this access now? So first of all, it's a relatively new field. Its first medical reference was around the 1789. However, medicine itself has been a thing since the BCs. And research has been coming, innovation has been coming that shows that it can reduce your anxiety, influence your mood, and even affect rehabilitation for certain neurological disorders. However, because it's such a new field, policies and insurance stuff is lagging behind. So the countries I studied in order to talk about access to sound therapy are Canada, Jordan, and India. I'll talk about why I specifically chose these countries with regards to their cultural and historical context with regards to medicine. So firstly, Canada. Now then, Canada has a universal Medicare cover with something called a medical core. However, complementary and alternative medicine, like I was talking about, is private pay, so it actually doesn't fall under that universal Medicare. As a result, health is often provincial. It depends on the province, and throughout all of these provinces in Canada, music therapy is listed, but there's nothing about specific singing bowl or vibration therapy ways to do music therapy. There's no guidelines or regulations. On top of that, in terms of insurance, oftentimes private insurers are going to get reimbursed only if the practitioner themselves are MTA certified. So what does this mean? Oftentimes in Canada, a lot of hospitals that want to perform sound therapy are going to do it under the guise of a research grant, so that they can actually get the funding to do it. And clinics are self-regulated because regulation is often provincial by a larger board, in this case the CAMT, or the Canadian Association of Music Therapy, their code of ethics. Next, India. Now then, India has a long heritage with mantra chanting and raga therapy. And in the 1990s, things liberalized, and with tourism, it started to spread throughout the whole world. In terms of regulation bodies, regulation is maintained by Ayush. They regulate something called Ayurveda, which stands for whole body healing, and yoga. And this is kind of where sound healing applies to, although there isn't really a license for it. As a result, a lot of these practitioners are operating freely with yoga licenses or meditation labels, in this case, Nadar yoga licenses, and a lot of hospitals are public hospitals are often very rare to find, while private ones are more common. And finally, Jordan. Now then, Jordan is really unique because it's really driven by religion, whether that be tribal religion or more throughout the country, Islam. And because of refugees driving resources, there's been a lot of strain on medicine there. Now then, everything is related to the Ministry of Health, and they don't really have a stance with regards to sound therapy. That is, with their regulations, they don't say whether they're for or against it. Really, the only things they mention with regards to it is herbs or acupuncture. And as a result, a lot of the practitioners in Jordan are in a legal gray zone. They don't really know if they can practice sound therapy because they're not sure if it's legal. And oftentimes for cash, they therefore rely on tourists or people coming in versus locals because sound therapy just doesn't mesh with the Islam religion. So this eventually led to my research question, which was what specific factors shape an individual's freedom to access sound therapy in Canada, Jordan, and India? And my thesis was that this access to sound therapy depends on culture, professional networks, and government policy rather than just the clinical effects of sound therapy. So in other words, my null hypothesis was that sound therapy access is maintained by its clinical effects, while my alternate was exactly my thesis. It was the culture, professional networks, and government policy. So in order to test this out, I did what's called a phenomenological design, or in other words, focusing on lived experiences. In order to do this, I interviewed 6 people, 2 from each country, through semi-structured Zoom interviews. What I would do is I would ask them 5 core questions with regards to sound therapy, and based on their answers, anything that needed further understanding or clarity, I would ask them about, and really understand what it was like to practice sound therapy within their certain context. And eventually this would take 60 to 80 minutes, and I would look at the actual transcripts of these interviews and apply what's called a thematic coding process. Essentially what this means is I'm looking at the actual words these people are saying and looking for similarities of themes across all of these countries. But I'll get more into that later. So for the actual interviewees, firstly from Canada, I interviewed Jennifer Buchanan and Dr. Laurel Young. Now, these 2 people are contrasted because Buchanan focuses more on a clinical aspect of sound therapy, while Dr. Laurel Young focuses more on a research. So one is clinical applications versus actual vibration research. In India, I interviewed Dr. T.V. Saidam and Bharat Sharma. T.V. Saidam really talked about policy advocacy, specifically regulations with regards to Indian government, while Bharat Sharma talked about the cultural applications of sound therapy, how we can integrate new practices into things like singing bowls and mantras. And finally, from Jordan, I interviewed Dr. Abir Kupti and Omar Haddad. Abir Kupti talked once again about integrating these sound therapy practices, Arabic chanting, and what he calls CBT sessions. And Omar Haddad, once again, talked more about the cultural applications of sound therapy, really meshing it with local Islam traditions and local imams. Now then, going back to the thematic coding process. So this is just an example here of something Dr. Kupti said when I interviewed him. He said, some clients love chanting while others fear it's against religion. No clear policy, so we adapt quietly. So what I did is I literally looked at the words he said. In this case, I highlighted against religion or adapt quietly, and I would mark that as religious concern. And then no clear policy as policy clarity. Now then, this is what's called open coding. Then from there, I would look at certain themes or open codes throughout all 6 of these interviews, and I would look at the ones that came up the most frequently, and those would be my axial themes or my actual results. So in this case, I have culture or religion and policy clarity. So my results would be the themes that came up the most frequently across all 4 of my countries. So speaking of, here are the 4 themes that I came up with. The number one thing that pulled up throughout all 4 countries was insurance and funding. I think in her interview, Jennifer Buchanan talked about how only about a quarter of her clients were actually reimbursed for music therapy. And because of the vagueness of government regulations with regards to it, singing bowls and choirs and chanting like that was often excluded. And in Jordan, India, it's even worse. There's 0% formal cover. And as a result, a lot of these practitioners who are looking for the money to do these singing bowls and sound therapy practices need to get their cash from tourists and not just locals. So in other words, cost is the first gatekeeper, not just for the clients that need to know how much they have to pay in order to get these sound therapy, but also for the practitioners to know how much they need to spend in order to give it to the client. Next was policy clarity. Now then, Laurel Young talked about how in the provincial regulations, music therapy itself is named. However, there's no specific vibrational tools or methods to do that sound music therapy within the provincial regulations. In Jordan, like I mentioned before, there's no explicit stance. And as a result, practitioners like Omar Haddad are in a gray zone. They don't know whether they can actually do sound therapy without being arrested. And as a result, Omar Haddad and Dr. Kupti have to often operate under different licenses, like psychology licenses, in order to do this, have the excuse to do sound therapy. And finally, from India, the Ayush, the regulatory board for sound therapy, they're silent on it. They mention it, they say they're for it, but they don't, once again, they don't talk about how exactly to do sound therapy or what is the right way to do it. So this uncertainty and vagueness, it's slowing down the adoption of sound therapy by the citizens because they don't know if it's okay to do it, and for the practitioners because, well, they have to do all of these loopholes in order to actually practice sound therapy. And the third theme I noted was culture or religion. Something that came up throughout my interviews with Canada was that everything really needed to be evidence-based before proceeding. And vibration and sound-based healing, because it's such a relatively new field and there isn't that much evidence, it's labeled as too alternative and too radical. And as a result, people are less likely to take it. Jordan, everything has to align with religion. Everything has to align specifically with Islamic comfort. So your local imams, things like that. If sound therapy practices don't mesh well with that, people just aren't as likely to do it. And with India, well, that's just an example of what works, because with the history India has with singing, for example, yoga, mantras, chanting, and it's shown that sound therapy, that's so already meshed in Indian culture, and it really works with the population. So adoption of sound therapy is heavily married to how much it fits with the country's culture and its religion. And the final thing, I kind of already mentioned this, was professional legitimacy. So there are loopholes that a lot of these people are doing in order to actually practice sound therapy. For example, in Canada, they have the CAMT, Canadian American Music Therapy Association membership that builds trust. In Jordan, Dr. Kupti and Omar Haddad have psychology licenses rather than actual sound therapy licenses or doctorates in order to do this chanting work. And in India, people use nether yoga or classical music or meditation licenses in order to build the trust that they know what they're talking about. However, these are just broad credentials. They're not a doctorate, they're not an MD, and these are really de facto licenses to practice sound therapy. No country really issues these sound therapy licenses. So, with regards to those results, here's how it ties back to the freedom principles. For freedom of the individual, well, we as people have the right to pursue holistic care without legal or cultural ramifications, whether that be for the client or the practitioner. For personal responsibility, well, we have the responsibility to vet out these practitioners to make sure they are professionally legitimate and know what they're talking about before actually taking their medicine. And looking to the future making a difference, well, these policymakers and governments, they should institute change to increase access, whether that be to sound therapy or anything else, in the future. Now, there are some limitations in the study, as you can see, whether that be the lack of number of interviews or self-report bias, but yeah. And overall recommendations. The number one recommendation I had, whether it be for all of these countries, is to have regulatory bodies in these countries write explicit guidelines on what exactly sound therapy is, how to practice it, and how to get a license for it. And whether that be making real certification modules under the existing medical boards, the Ayush or the CAMT, in order to actually get sound therapy practitioners. Because a lot of these people are just doing other things and calling themselves professionals in sound therapy. The second thing is to pilot and publish the outcome of cost data. So that way, the people know exactly what they're paying for and the practitioners know how much they have to spend in order to do these methods. And finally, especially with places like Jordan, where religion is everything, you need to bridge the sound therapy with culture by connecting with the local imams and really connecting with yoga leading figures. So my conclusion was that sound therapy science is not the main factor. It's policy gaps, cost, and cultural fits. So we have to reject the null hypothesis that it was just the clinical effects and accept the alternate hypothesis. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Alexis Wilson. I am a current senior at Brookfield Academy. I've been attending here since level A. I am a BA lifer, and next year I will be continuing my education at Georgetown University studying government. My topic today is freedom to access anxiety and depression medication. As someone who self-studied AP psychology last year and is the president of our school's psychology club, I do have a big interest in psychology and destigmatization of psychiatric medication. I will be studying this using the countries of Brazil, Italy, and Singapore through the lens of the BA freedom philosophy. Okay, first, my ultimate hypothesis. While government policies and healthcare programs may have an impact on the freedom to access anxiety or depression medications, cultural stigma and mental health cultural stigma around mental health problems and treatment has a greater impact on that freedom. Therefore, my null hypothesis is that government policies are the main barrier to psychiatric medication, and my alternate is my ultimate hypothesis, that cultural stigma is the main barrier. So I will be looking at personal responsibility, freedom of the individual, and looking to the future, making a difference. Once again, we will revisit these near the end of my presentation. So first, some definitions. Depression is a low mood or loss of pleasure or interest in activities for long periods of time. Depression can be short or long-term, ranging from weeks to many years. And approximately 5% of adults worldwide suffer from depression. However, this number is steadily increasing, with about 42% of Generation Z, ages 13 to 28, having a depression diagnosis. Anxiety is very similar, with about 4% of adults worldwide having anxiety. However, 61% of Generation Z suffering from anxiety. Now, anxiety affects those who often experience fear and worry that is both intense and excessive. And these feelings are accompanied by physical tension and other behavioral symptoms, meaning that there is a big difference between feeling anxious and actually having anxiety due to the physical symptoms that accompany it. So now also a brief history of psychiatric medication. In the 1950s, the field of psychiatry was introduced with the first psychiatric medications. These were tricyclic antidepressants, MAOIs, and benzodiazepines introduced. However, these tended to be not very safe and also very potentially addictive and or harmful. So these were only used in the most extreme of cases and often for different disorders such as bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. However, in 1988, Prozac was launched on the market and it became the first selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, or SSRIs. Immediately after this, lots of other similar drugs were introduced on the market and psychiatric prescriptions immediately increased given the safety and efficacy of these drugs. By 2010, approximately 10% of Americans were using SSRIs, and these are viewed as very safe. All right, once again, my countries are Brazil, Italy, and Singapore, and I chose these countries because they all are very different culturally and have different public healthcare systems. First, Brazil. So dating back to its colonization by Portugal in the 1500s, Brazil has been predominantly Catholic and they speak Portuguese. As mentioned in Harrison's presentation, there is a major wealth gap within the country, and this has also led to some long-term political unrest due to corruption. And also there's a very major difference in rural versus urban living in Brazil. There's a big difference in standard of living and wealth. Now, healthcare is a right enshrined in the Brazilian constitution. And the SUS system was set up in 1990 as Brazil's public healthcare system. Psychiatric hospitals, therefore, are also managed by the SUS. And Brazil also has CAP centers, which are essentially group therapy-based centers rather than mental asylums in an effort at deinstitutionalization. However, despite all of this, lots of Brazilians have called for mental health reform since the 1990s. And in the 2000s, Brazil finally started addressing this with a reform plan. However, to this day, stigmatization still exists, particularly in men, minorities, and those in more rural areas. Now for Italy. Italy is also predominantly Roman Catholic, and tourism is a major component of the economy and the culture there. Dating back to the ancient Roman Empire, Italy has a lot of history and people love to visit it. And Italy has a rapidly aging population. There are tensions between northern and southern Italy, with the northern part of Italy being much richer, and Italy is also a member of the EU. Italy also has free public health care, the SSN, dating back to 1978, and it is ranked as one of the best public healthcare systems in the world. Also in 1978, Law 180 was introduced, which encouraged community-based therapy centers rather than asylums, another country's attempt at deinstitutionalization. And Italy has been regarded as one of the most progressive countries when it comes to this deinstitutionalization. However, there is still a stigma around mental illness and problems regarding it. Now for Singapore, it is my newest country. It recently gained independence in 1965. While it is very small by area, it is very urban and it has a pretty large population. It is considered to be the freest economy in the world, and it also has very low infant mortality rates and life expectancy rates. Singapore does have universal public health care. However, an element of it is mandatory saving for private health care. And then the public health care is only dipped into when those funds are entirely depleted. So private healthcare is also a major element in Singapore. Singapore also has the National Mental Health Committee established in 2005, which has released many plans detailing ways to reform the mental health stigmatization in Singapore. Actually, the Ministry of Health conducted surveys on Singaporeans' education levels regarding different mental disorders and mental illnesses, and there were significant increases from 2014 to 2024 as to the education level of Singaporeans. There have also been lots of campaigns and attempts at destigmatization. So now, research methodology. I had 4 ultimate questions that I wanted to answer through my research. Number 1, is there a stigma in each of these countries, which there is? 2, do these stigmas arise more from social factors or from government campaigns or lack thereof? 3, is voluntary psychiatric care readily available for those who are seeking it? And 4, are people more hesitant to seek out psychiatric care rather than therapy or other non-medical care? So to answer these questions, I used quantitative surveys and qualitative interviews. So in my surveys, one of the questions that I asked was essentially the likelihood for you or somebody close to you to receive any treatment for mental illness. From this, Brazil ranked as the most likely, then Singapore, and then Italy. However, when I asked people's openness to sharing mental health concerns, Italy ranked above Singapore, whereas Singapore, far more people said that you would tell very few people if there were to be a mental health concern. Similarly, I asked how many people do you know who have shared with you that they have had a mental illness or mental health concern? And Singapore also ranked last once again, with Italy passing it. However, then when I asked your likelihood to receive actual psychiatric medication, Italy once again fell to the bottom, with Singapore passing it. Now, things to note. Brazil, when asked, people, they said that their number 1 barrier to receiving psychiatric medication would be social stigma, not government regulations. However, there is a major rural-urban divide once again in Brazil. The people that I had responding to my survey all came from urban areas, and they noted this, whereas they felt that their culture was very progressive and open to seeking out mental help. They all agreed that in more rural areas, there might not be a psychiatric care facility for even hours if you wanted to seek one out. In Italy, however, they agreed that the understaffing and long wait lists are the biggest barrier to stop people from receiving psychiatric medication. And also, they said that there was a major lack of education, with lots of people feeling that medications are not safe, not effective, and potentially addictive, which did not arise in Brazil or Singapore. Then in Singapore, once again, the biggest barrier to receiving medication was listed as social stigma, and people also listed that they felt very uncomfortable talking about their concerns. While Singaporeans are very well educated on mental health conditions, they do not feel comfortable sharing it with those around them if they actually are struggling. A lot of people noted a particular ambition-driven culture where mental health just is not a priority in Singapore. So then for interviews, I interviewed from Brazil, Natalia O'Hara, and she mentioned at length the rural and urban differences that she saw. She lives in Sao Paulo, and she said that in her community, things are very progressive, very open, and people are very comfortable talking about mental health. However, she knows many people who live in rural areas who would never even think of it or speak about it or mention it. She also spoke about the benefits of private mental wellness campaigns. She said that lots of employers near her have instituted things within their firms rather than seeking out government assistance or government ad campaigns regarding mental health. In Italy, I had the opportunity of interviewing Dr. Vlatkovic, a therapist, and Dr. Gaston, a psychiatrist. And they both agreed that the number 1 issue, once again, is understaffing of psychiatric facilities. They said that they often have patients that have been on year-long wait lists looking for somebody to kind of take them in, which obviously this can discourage people from receiving psychiatric medication. They also said that a lot of their patients also have expressed these fears of the safety of these medications, even though they are globally regarded as very safe and effective. They also noted a difference in how different age groups might view psychiatric medication, as Italy does once again have a rapidly aging population, and overwhelmingly their older citizens do not feel as comfortable talking about psychiatry, let alone mental health. This could be a major issue in the coming years in Italy. For Singapore, I had the opportunity of interviewing Emile Delisle and Ashley Cristobal, two people who did a study abroad program for an extended stay in Singapore. And they both agreed that resources are available but not frequently advertised at all, despite them being seemingly well-funded. For example, Ashley Cristobal had a different stay in a hospital, not related to anything psychiatric or mental health. However, she did not know about any of the programs in Singapore until she was there and she saw advertisements for it in an actual hospital. On the other hand, Emile Delisle spoke at length about the negative culture created, especially in Singapore's universities and schools, where people do not feel comfortable at all sharing when things are not going well for them mentally. In fact, he said that he attended the National University in Singapore, which is the #1 university in Singapore. It is very well funded. He said that there was not one resource or service funded by the university for mental wellness. So all of this, in conclusion, does support my hypothesis that while government policies and healthcare programs might have an impact on freedom of those in Brazil, Italy, and Singapore to access anxiety or depression medication, the cultural stigma and mental health problems and treatment has a greater impact on this freedom. So some general recommendations that I have for all of my countries. Number one, invest more into public psychiatric services. All three of my countries, maybe except for rural Brazil, have some of the most highly regarded and well-funded public healthcare systems. However, their psychiatric services are disproportionately not well-funded. Even in Singapore, where it is very urban, they still have long wait lines and understaffing of psychiatrists and things like that. Number two, target ad campaigns towards certain groups. There was a difference in how age groups and rural versus urban citizens might view mental health listed in every single one of my countries. For this reason, while a lot of countries have done ad campaigns, including all three of mine, they target them generally using social media or using forms of media that generally younger, more urban citizens will be viewing anyways, which does not target the groups that need to see these campaigns anyways. And thirdly, I would say education on the prevalence of mental health struggles is necessary. As noted in one of my first slides, these are very common problems. However, in all three of my countries, people shared sentiments of feeling alone and feeling like nobody else was going through what they were, despite the prevalence of these struggles. So now some country-specific recommendations. For Brazil, Brazil needs to direct more resources towards their rural areas for all of their healthcare, but also particularly towards their psychiatric services. Additionally, the success of some of their private wellness campaigns should definitely be researched by their mental health committees and looked into more, as these were very beneficial for those who had experienced them, and I would encourage more of those. For Italy, their #1 concern should be the understaffing problem and the long wait lists. They need to find more psychiatrists and pour more resources into this. And secondly, an education campaign on the safety of antidepressants should also take place, given there is a disproportionate amount of Italians that found these medications like SSRIs to be unsafe. Finally, in Singapore, they have lots of well-funded resources readily available, but they are not publicized. People just simply don't know that they exist. So instead of directing more funding towards those resources, they should direct that funding towards publicizing them. Additionally, Singapore needs to encourage more wellness campaigns in the private sector, particularly in universities and schools. As shown by some of my interviews, that is just extremely lacking in Singapore, and it should be addressed immediately. So finally, the BA Freedom philosophy. Looking at this through the lens of personal responsibility, people ultimately need to feel the desire to seek out mental help, especially psychiatric help, if needed. And this is something that could impact both you personally as well as your community. So this needs to occur. Freedom of the individual. Ultimately, the individual is the only person who can make the say in all three of these countries as to whether or not they're receiving psychiatric medication, and if so, how they want to go about that, what different care facilities they might seek out. And finally, looking to the future, making a difference. At the end of the day, while destigmatization is the ultimate goal, first, people need to recognize that they are not alone. As mentioned on my general recommendation slide, many people still feel that they are alone in this whole process of psychiatric care. And at this point, while destigmatization probably will not come for many years to come, normalization, or at least a greater acceptance of mental health concerns and mental illnesses needs to occur. Thank you very much.
Any questions? Right. Any questions overall regarding the course? Okay. Omar? Yes?
So I have a question on how you got all these interviews and got all this data. So like as a general question, how did you guys reach out to these people and get a hold of them?
Yeah. Okay, so honestly for my topic, finding people readily willing to talk about mental health was not easy. And if anything, I think that shows more of why we need to be talking about it and studying it. But I reached out honestly to numerous different universities, for me, psychiatric hospitals, psychiatrists, therapists, things like that. Anybody who might seem knowledgeable in the field at all. And from there, I sent out surveys, asked people to circulate them with their friends and family and things like that.
For me, in all three of my countries, I had contacts there. So that was either through my father or my father's friends, or even Senor Alvarez, who is a teacher here. And then I contacted specifically professors in each of my countries, and I asked them to give the surveys to their students. They assigned it as an assignment, so all the students did fill out my survey, so I was able to get a lot of responses that way. But yeah, that is how I was able to contact my people.
Yeah, so for me, my research was focusing mainly on like normal people, like parents who know the culture and know the system of education. So I just reached out using email lists, online communities, forums, and stuff like that. I sent out the surveys that way, and then the interview was something separate. I sent out questionnaires and surveys.
For me, it was a mix of cold emails, honestly, and utilizing the connections that I had. I mean, I know people back in Canada because I've lived here my whole life. At least for Canada, a lot of it was just reaching out to people I already knew and seeing if they knew any professors in universities or just people that are clinically licensed in sound therapy and stuff like that.
And then reaching out to other Brookfield Academy contacts.
Yes.
Like in Jordan.
Yeah. Jordan, Dr. Ruby gave me contact.
That wasn't hard.
Hi, great job. Super impressive, all of you. Really nice. Did any of you look back then at the United States views as comparison as another country to evaluate how it stacked up in comparison to the other countries? Or was that not part of your interest or study at all?
I mean, for me personally, I did look at the US originally when looking at things and just kind of knowing how we culturally think of mental health, mental illness, mental health, and psychiatric medication. I did not ultimately choose to compare it fully with the US. However, I did look into it originally.
I conducted my study in the United States as well, so I interviewed people, I had surveys sent out in the United States, and in that statistical analysis that I did, my expected values were from the United States. So I was comparing each of my three countries to what was expected from the United States. So that's kind of how I concluded that there was a statistical significance in my countries.
Yeah, so for me, a little bit similar to Lexi, just kind of the standard of America was in the background and viewing everything through the American lens, but ultimately I didn't include it in my surveys or in my paper presentation.
Yeah, kind of the same thing for me. The reason I chose the countries I chose was that they were all very different, or they have a very stark contrast with regards to how the governments really treated sound therapy. Although, if you really want to look at it that way, Canada is honestly very similar to the U.S. with regards to how they view sound therapy. I think that America is also very evidence-based in terms of advancing medicine. So, I think that Canada and America are pretty similar in that regard. But otherwise, no, I didn't really think about America. It was in the background, with Harrison and Moxie.
I have lots of questions. You guys did a great job, by the way. I have questions for everybody except for my son Harrison. Alexis, so I have a question for you. So there's more than one way to handle psychiatric issues, anxiety, depression, therapy being one of them. Do you have any sense as to what the barriers were culturally as it pertained to therapy? meaning it's almost easier to take the pill than it is to get therapy when there's cultural barriers. And the second question is, you want to do government policy. If you're making government policy and having an influence trying to make a difference, you see the role of technology playing a difference in the future.
Okay, I'll start with number one with the difference culturally between like cognitive therapy versus psychiatry. So I did try to analyze this a little bit, and I have a difference of like, I asked each of my interviewees specifically, like, do you find that there is a greater hesitancy to seek out psychiatry rather than therapy? And the only one that really had that difference was in Italy, with their just generally concerns around psychiatry. In Singapore, there was actually a little bit like you kind of mentioned, where how some people find it easier than going through like cognitive therapy, as psychiatry generally will present a quicker fix, I guess, to the problem. And in Brazil, there wasn't really a big difference noted by my interviewee. I also tried to analyze that. I had the survey questions on like likelihood to receive any treatment versus psychiatric treatment, and those had pretty similar results overall. And then secondly, with government policy, I think that technology definitely is important. I mean, it is the way, like, with ad campaigns and things like that, we think traditionally of billboards or things like that. Like, it definitely will move more as technology advances, and I think all that really governments can do is try to stay on top of it to the best of their ability.
Cool, thank you. Mahi, so in your slide, you talked about Spain, and they had a lot of organ donors, right?
Right.
And a lot of that was their opt-out system. So I'm curious, from your perspective, because you seem very excited about organ transplantation, it is a miracle, right? Do you see any freedom challenges when you're talking about an opt-in or an opt-out system? Obviously, the opt-out system is going to generate more donors because a lot of people don't think about it. They don't know, and at least they've got to go through the process to opt out. Do you see any freedom challenges between those two options?
Of course, and this was something that was discussed at length in our IFS Thursday seminars. So obviously there is that aspect of some people might not realize that they have to go opt out and they might not want to be organ donors. However, it is important to note that in every single high school in Spain, there is that month-long education program where they do educate those young people who are about to be young adults on what is their legal, what is the legalities of this, and they do educate them that way. And also, just in terms of in Spain, they are very, very prideful of their organ donation rates. And so, as I interviewed them, I realized that it is very publicized there. Like, people are like, oh, we want to be number one. We want to donate. We want to keep our ranking up here. And so, I think overall, they're very, very educated about their donation policies. So, yes, there is that aspect of, does it necessarily mean that there's that challenge of freedom, but I do think that most people are understanding what they are obligated to.
So the education is probably the key point in that.
Yeah.
Interesting. Sheree, so how you doing?
I'm doing well.
Sound therapy, I'm very curious. So when you talk about we're kind of using loopholes to practice sound therapy, does that mean it's illegal to practice and charge for sound therapy, or you charge your healthcare systems and payers for that?
Well, no. I think the main idea I was pointing out was just the fact that it was vague. So it wasn't the fact that it was legal or not legal. It was the fact that no one knew whether it was legal or not legal, and therefore they just didn't want to take that chance, like literally. So that's why they did all these loopholes and stuff, because on the off chance that they're about to get arrested or they're going to lose their license because of this thing that they're doing, they just don't want to take that chance.
Yeah, it's amazing because there's no risk in chanting and harmonizing the whole, right? But there's some benefits.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Thank you very much.